Let It Be is the final officially released Beatles album. It came out just after the official breakup of the band was announced to the public, and there is a debate whether this should be considered their final album or not. Almost all of the album was recorded before Abbey Road, it's just that a few songs had some touch-ups and changes after they were originally recorded, but we'll get into that in a bit. So even though Let It Be was worked on before Abbey Road, why did it come out afterwards? It's a little bit complicated, and a lot of it has to do with the unique way that they went about recording this one. I'd like to give a lot of context before we talk about the process of creating Let It Be, which at the time was known as Get Back, and to do this, we need to understand exactly why Let It Be would have so many problems. Let's look back at the time that the Beatles had a major shift in 1966. This was when they decided they no longer wanted to tour the world and perform live for a huge audience anymore. This decision was made for various reasons. During their big tour in 1966, the band ended up stopping in the Philippines for a few shows in July. This section of the tour was a disaster. There was a lot of miscommunication with the transportation, and they were constantly surrounded by armed guards. The band members would later remark that it felt a little hostile. At one point, Imelda Marcos, the First Lady, invited the group for breakfast, but after the band's manager Brian Epstein declined it on their behalf, she still tried to go ahead with it. And because the band didn't even know it was happening, they didn't show up. They would still go on to play their shows here, however, but after it was broadcasted on the news that the band didn't show up for her breakfast, the public reception of the band quickly changed as they were seen as disrespecting the First Lady. This news ended up coming out right before they were supposed to leave the country, so it became really difficult to secure a ride away from their hotel, and at every step of the way there were some new obstacles. At the airport, when the band was trying to move their equipment, the escalators were turned off, only to be turned back on after they finished getting everything up them. And another major thing is that their plane ended up being grounded. The only way they were allowed to leave was to pay a fine, which was claimed to be taxes. The small section of the tour left a sour taste in their mouths. They vowed to never go back there again, and this wasn't even the end of the tour. The next section of the tour would take place about a month later. This would be their tour of the United States, and it is plagued with controversy after it happened during the Bigger Than Jesus fiasco that came out when John Lennon made some comments about Christianity in an interview. These comments that were taken out of context led to death threats against the band, and the already stressful tour was made even worse. During one of their shows, a firecracker was even thrown on the stage to scare them, but they played through it. The US tour would be the band's last tour together. All four of the band members were just exhausted both mentally and physically. There's a lot of strain that comes with touring the world and always being on the move. And you can add on to this that they weren't given much freedom or vacations. And then you can add on to that they were always trying to make and record new music. The lifestyle just couldn't work forever, and the band would end up becoming a studio band from this point onwards. I will say, they didn't plan for this to be the final tour. But this tour was just such a disaster that they didn't want to go out again. This is one of the biggest decisions for the band, and it would change them a lot, as now they were able to focus on the production and overall sound more than ever, and they never had to worry about making a song work for a live setting anymore. This was a newfound freedom, one that would on some level lead to each member developing themselves more as individuals. The added free time that came with this also led to the Beatles taking on projects outside of the band and traveling on their own. It was a new beginning for them. Their legendary album Revolver was new and exciting, and they got to be a lot more experimental with that one. So they wanted to keep that momentum going. Music as a whole was changing for them, and instead of treating their music like music, they saw it more like an art form. Paul would end up having the idea to create a new image for themselves. They would be a new band entirely for their next album. The final product would be known as Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. The thing is though, there were some issues with this new approach, and John and George weren't the biggest fans of it. John would state that he never played around with the idea of being in a new band, really. He wrote and made the songs that he wanted to, and they kinda just worked with the idea that Paul had. And George was just feeling underutilized already, and kinda thrown to the side. It would be during the production of this album that the cracks that had been slowly forming became deeper. These cracks formed because they were no longer playing together as a group, with the goal of creating a new song that they would eventually play for an audience. The process now was a production that usually didn't even involve each member of the band. Sgt. Pepper's in particular was headed by Paul, It was his magnum opus at the time, and he would have a lot of control over this album as a whole. This would lead to some strains in the group's relationships with each other. The ending result, though, is an album that is very highly regarded even today, and it blew people away at the time. But the thing is, this is kind of where everything really started to go downwards. 3 months after this album came out, the man who had been with them from the very start would pass away. Brian Epstein was the band's manager, and his passing was a devastating loss to the group. He ensured that they got everything that they needed and arranged so much for them. He was not only their manager, but he was a very close friend. At the time, it was like the world was ripped out from under them. His passing came out of nowhere, and the band was in India at the time on a journey to learn more about peace and the meaning of life. At a critical moment of self-discovery for them, things grew dark. With Brian passing away, Paul McCartney would end up taking an even greater role in trying to lead the band. I will say, it's not like the other members didn't have a voice, but honestly, at this point, John and George especially were starting to get a bit fed up with the band as a whole. They would end up working on their next project, Magical Mystery Tour, and the idea was to have a television special, and it would pretty much all be set up by the band themselves. This special wouldn't do as well. It was criticized at the time for being lackluster, and it wasn't what everybody was expecting after Sgt. Pepper's. So this project was kind of seen as a bit of a failure in the sense for the band. And going into their next album, which was the White Album, it definitely didn't help morale. The White Album is often noted to be the point where the band was done with each other. It had an unbelievably rough production with the likes of George Martin and Ringo taking a leave of absence, and Jeff Emmerich, their sound engineer, getting up and quitting. It was a painful album to record. The band as a whole was at their limits with each other, and there was a lot of arguments, and the atmosphere was tense. Yoko Ono would also start making appearances in the studio around this time, which would further cause some complications. It was typical that the band would work within the studio with only the people who were associated with the music. There wasn't really supposed to be anybody else around. But now you have Yoko coming in with John for every session and having his full attention. It really didn't go over too well. I will note though, that with Yoko now being present, the other band members started bringing around their wives and girlfriends too. By the end of this album, you had John who was pretty much done with the band already, Paul desperately trying to hold on to everything, George finding himself as an artist and as a person, and Ringo just being there for everybody. Things could have pretty much ended here. Each person had changed so much over the last few years that pretty much the band being together was a burden on them all. The idea of trying to reclaim the old essence of the band and return to a simple era is what would spark the Get Back project. The idea was to get the band back to their roots, film a television special, and play a few times live for a big audience. A fair amount of the songs present on Let It Be came from these sessions. The first few days weren't too bad for the group, but being in the studio for days on end and constantly being watched just made the tension start to grow again. Sure, they were having fun and joking around for a bit, but it was becoming too much. Their relationships were pretty much permanently damaged at this point, and John and George weren't even in favor of this idea at the time, but went along with it. The band started the sessions on January 2nd, 1969, and it only took 12 days before George got up and left. This was after having multiple issues and arguments with Paul and John. He was more than fed up, and he felt like he was brushed to the side and unrespected. A few days later, he would end up coming back after an agreement was made that they would continue their sessions at their Apple headquarters in a studio there, and the idea of playing some live shows would be dropped. Everybody agreed, and they would end up moving to the Apple building. Billy Preston ended up coming in to play with the group at the request of George, and he definitely did help to lighten up the mood. By the end of January, the band would play a small show on the rooftop of the Apple headquarters, and this is the very last time they would all play together. You know, remember how I mentioned that they were recorded 24/7? Well, this is also true to some extent for their sound too. After they finished all of their sessions, there was over 25 hours worth of tapes that could be cut down and used for the album. Nobody wanted to go through that. So the band gave it to a sound engineer that was brought in for this project and requested that he do something with it. This man was Glyn Johns. He tried to do something with all the tapes, and he ended up compiling multiple albums, but none of them were really liked by the Beatles. At the same time he was working hard on making a proper album, the band made the decision that they only wanted songs that would be featured or referenced in the new film to be included. After multiple months of working with what he had, Glenn made 4 different versions of the album, but none of them were good enough for the band. So, they would end up hiring a new person. This man was Phil Spector. Phil was brought in specifically at the request of John and George because they wanted this album to not be a stain on the band. They wanted something passable, and this is how they went about it. It was also without letting Paul or George Martin know. When Phil came in, he ended up using most of the pieces that Glenn had been piecing together, pretty much because he didn't want to go through all of the recordings as well. Phil is somebody who got the job done. He was given the raw recordings and decided to add to them instead of just using them as is. He added orchestral arrangements to The Long and Winding Road, Across the Universe, and I Me Mine. He added and removed some songs that Glenn was planning to have for an album, and did what he could with what he had. Before Phil was brought in, nobody was happy with how the album was turning out. But now you had John, George, and Ringo happy. So you know who wasn't happy with Phil? Paul McCartney and George Martin. George Martin's producing credit was also omitted from the album, and he was simply given a special thanks. The original idea for Get Back was to return to a simple time. The songs were supposed to be and sound simple to listen to compared to their last few albums. However, Phil came in and added more to the songs and gave it a new sound. Paul was livid over this, and for a good reason. He didn't know what was going on or get any notice of these changes. And when he finally did reach out, he was promptly ignored. To add insult to injury, all this was happening as the band was officially breaking up, so they were already pretty mad at each other, and this did not help. There's nothing that Paul McCartney or George Martin could do. The album would come out with Phil Spector's changes, and that was that. 30 years later, however, after an impromptu meeting between Paul and Michael Lindsay Hogg, the director of the original film, they would end up having a discussion and coming up with the idea to re-release the film with a remix of the original album to accompany it. Paul got to work on the album again, and he wanted it to be the way he envisioned it in the past. This is how Let It Be Naked began. All of the original recordings were still available, but a majority of the stuff that was worked on were once again the pieces that Glenn and Phil used for Let It Be. It was easier to use the best material because it was already there. Let It Be Naked is more than just a simple remix. Parts of the original album were omitted, such as the banter and the improv songs like Dig It and Maggie May. The song order on the album was rearranged a little bit, and Don't Let Me Down was added. Overall, the songs that are on Let It Be and Let It Be Naked are pretty much the same, with both albums using slightly different takes. But most, if not all, of Phil Spector's changes were taken away. Here's a fun fact. The 3 versions of the song Let It Be, so the single version, the album version, and the naked version, all have a different guitar solo by George Harrison. And for whatever reason, the cover Let It Be Naked had the same photo for each member of the band, except for George where they used a different one. He looked so unhappy. Let It Be went through a lot of changes. The recording of the album was a bit rough, and the Beatles were uninterested in the ending result for the most part. The only thing that they would want is that the album be good. Glenn Johns was given a lot of garbage recordings and was told to make something out of it. He tried his best with what he had and the rules that were put into place. After the band was unhappy, John and George took it upon themselves to find something better. And even though it went against their original plan, it made them happy. It was really only Paul and George Martin who didn't take too kindly to this, especially since songs like The Long and Winding Road were changed without permission. Let It Be is pretty much a soundtrack album, and that's why the chatter and the improv songs were added, but the naked version was supposed to be more like an actual album. Both versions of Let It Be are solid works, and having both of them is a good thing because you get to hear the same songs in 2 different styles. At the end of the day, we still have the albums, and we can listen to them when we want. Thank you for watching, and have a good day.